Nuclear deterrence. What is it exactly? It has taken different forms since the inception of the nuclear age in 1945. Well, nuclear is fairly straightforward, so let's start with the root word of deterrence, terre. To frighten with an overwhelming fear, or as Ambassador C. Paul Robinson put it, deterrence to frighten from carrying out acts, emotions of self-preservations. Or as American Admiral Richard Mize says, deterrence really rests upon a strategy of war prevention, not a strategy of war fighting. Which sounds lovely from a theoretical perspective, preventing war. However prudish a tactic it may appear to be, preventing war through intimidation or forcing logical calculations of cost versus outcome is still preventing war. But now when we put them together, nuclear deterrence is theoretically preventing nuclear war through the passive use of nuclear weaponry. As put by an American politician, the main purpose of the nuclear deterrent is to put an exclamation point on the end of the sentence that says, if you do bad things to us, we will do even worse things to you, so you better not do it in the first place. However, this policy of nuclear deterrence carries much heavier ramifications than intended. It brings a severe psychological impact upon those who it is supposed to protect, such as the children of the 1950s and 60s growing up with a misguided turtle named Bert, telling them they could duck in cover away nuclear annihilation. To the generations living within the height of the Cold War under fear of nuclear destruction through a mad policy of nuclear deterrence, literally named MAD, or Mutually Assured Destruction. Imagine yourself living under the bombardment of nuclear posturing and barrage of more and more powerful nuclear weaponry. According to S.J. Corrali in Psychological Effects of the Threat of Nuclear War, many studies have focused on children, finding that anxiety about social issues is high, but that cynicism and apathy set in rapidly. Conclusions from such studies show that denial and avoidance are some of the worst results, since they are a barrier to meaningful reaction. This is a glaring parallel to the children of the global warming age. The fear of an existential threat that one feels is in the power of an authority who mostly seems to lack critical acumen and employs an apathetic attitude towards enacting any effective change. Over the decades, the policy of nuclear deterrence has changed. It started with total annihilation when America was the only one with nuclear weaponry, followed by Truman-era ad hoc nuclear signaling, which then ran into President Ike Eisenhower's era of perilous brinksmanship. He was a bit of a cowboy who seriously considered the possibility of using nuclear weapons during the Korean War. He is also partially to blame for the rise of the military-industrial complex, which holds a lot of responsibility for the proliferation of nuclear weaponry in the Cold War arms race. The industry built under General Leslie Groves during the Manhattan Project was primed to continue into a profitable enterprise. War and preparation for war is big business. Eventually, nuclear tactics started to be dictated by a doctrine of civilian nuclear strategists with principles like credible threat, the demonstration of capabilities and willingness of using nuclear strikes. This was to shape the behavior of an adversary. Extended deterrence, where you have an umbrella of protection covering your allies. For example, if North Korea attacked Japan with a nuke, or in any capacity, the Americans would see it as a strike against themselves and use force up to nuclear weaponry in response. First strike, which is opposite of China's NFU or no first strike policy, which runs counter to the narrative that China is an aggressive nuclear force. Secure second strike, meaning once you absorb the nuclear bombardment of your attacker, you then in turn strike back with your surviving arsenal, which led to the nuclear triad of land, air, and naval nuclear weapons, a concept to maximize the effectiveness of a second strike capability via submarines, bombers, or ground-based weaponry such as ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles. The policy of mutually assured destruction, or MAD, as mentioned earlier, where, for example, Russia and the USA have that triad of nuclear capability and thusly would utterly destroy one another in the event of nuclear war. And so according to nuclear deterrence theory, they refrain from nuclear war out of the fact that neither side would survive. A tad overkill by design. Now, putting aside the morality of nukes and focusing on the practicality and effectiveness of nuclear weaponry, as most everyone can agree that nuclear weapons used against civilian populations is incredibly immoral, and that preserving the life of this planet and its inhabitants is an easy position to get behind. Nuclear deterrence is an incredibly expensive endeavor, as nuclear weapons are not even tactically effective when considered from the point of operational deployment. They irradiate the lands which are usually trying to be conquered and occupied, not salted and razed like the Romans with their payback on Carthage. To provide some historic examples of their lack of practicality, the amount required when President Ike Eisenhower decided to look for options during the Korean War was that far too many would be necessary, and they believed that their deployment would dilute the fears of how awesome and powerful they are on the global stage. Nukes may topple cities in devastating fashion, but they are much less effective for wiping out troop positions. The concept of a tactical nuke is not exactly realistic either, especially the concept of a limited strike. Limited strikes really cannot be seen as limited by the enemy, and thusly negate the entire premise of limited. An American report showed that 200 missiles looks on radar to be an all-out attack, and when 900 missiles is the limited amount for a limited attack, you can see this is far from limited to be a little bit limited redundant. They are just not a practical or useful weapon. Too many were necessary in the Gulf War when Dick Cheney looked at them as a possibility. So many were needed in order to destroy even a single tank battalion, which led Colin Powell and his associates to be so discouraged that they burned their report and never discussed this option or concept again. To reiterate, they are really good at committing war crimes, targeting civilian populations and destroying city centers, but not that great at actually fighting wars. So with this lack of efficiency, but incredible psychological and monetary cost, is nuclear deterrence really worth it? There is another cost attributed towards the notion of an accidental nuclear war, a fact that weighs heavy on the psychology of the active imaginations of younger generations. Studies have shown how living under such a heavy threat can warp healthy development and lean towards cynicism and a sense of distrust of authority figures. The notion that machines can eventually fail us, how our human faculties can potentially fail to properly recognize a threat and start a cascading domino effect of launching warheads under the pretense of being under attack. Mistaken perceptions of nuclear threats have occurred multiple times throughout the past, such as a flock of Canadian geese in the 1950s activating the Distant Early Warning Line radar system, and then again in the 1960s when a reflection caused by meteor showers and lunar radar triggered the Ballistic Missile Warning System. Again, in 1979, a scrambling of aircraft was caused by a human operator error transmitting erroneous information that the United States was facing a nuclear threat. Then in 1980, the malfunction of a component of hardware, a chip within a mini-computer linked to the defense apparatus, caused 100 B-52 nuclear-capable bombers in Air Force One to prepare to take to the skies until it was realized to be an error just in the nick of time. Then there is the 1983 story of Soviet Air Defense Forces Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov. He is credited with narrowly avoiding World War III by possessing enough humanity and resolve to hold off from relaying what turned out to be false information of an imminent American nuclear attack, and thusly avoiding the outbreak of all-out nuclear war. Coming out of the Cold War tensions, the mistakes continued. In 1995, there was a scientific rocket launched by a joint Norwegian and American research team to study the Northern Lights, which was mistaken as a nuclear ICBM and caused Russian authorities to wake Boris Yeltsin from a midnight slumber to groggily decide whether or not to heed his military advised suggestions of a retaliatory strike. Thankfully, these situations were diffused before ever coming to the fruition of an all-out nuclear catastrophe. But these do not even get into the numerous nuclear weapon accidents categorized as broken arrows. The actual figure is unknown, but the US Department of Defense has admitted to a total of 32 broken arrows, with a total of 6 completely lost nuclear weapons. They even had an incident of dropping a bomb accidentally on a town in South Carolina, wiping out a girl's playhouse and destroying a family home. The weapon never went hot. These accidents highlight the risks taken when dealing with nuclear weaponry on any scale. The environmental costs of nuclear deterrence have been incredibly high, as well as the collateral damages of peoples unfortunate enough to have been involved with the extraction of nuclear materials, such as uranium mining or those in close proximity to the testing of nuclear weaponry. These peoples live with constant reminders in the form of nuclear scars upon their bodies, families, and lands. Then we have the stockpiles of nuclear waste sitting in South Pacific Islands, tempting fate with rising sea levels, and those sitting in temporary storage facilities across the globe awaiting a permanent facility. Well, in reality, any storage will always be temporary for nuclear waste, as it will remain hazardous for tens of thousands of years, a malignant tumor imposed upon our ancestors of the future. Nuclear deterrence causes festering wounds that will never fully heal. We are taking a great risk when we put the security of our world behind nukes, which by almost every estimate and calculation would at the minimum wipe out hundreds of millions of peoples and severely alter life on Earth as we know it, and to a maximum, completely extinguish human life. Aptly put by academic Ward Wilson, if human beings are prone to folly, and we are, if human beings are involved in nuclear deterrence, and we are involved in every step, then by definition, nuclear deterrence is inherently flawed. It will fail. It's not a question of if, it's just a question of when. And that's just human nature and logic. It's not some fancy theory. We've been lucky for 70 years, and we should be grateful. As a realist, I don't think we should continue to tempt fate. When considering the entanglement of nuclear deterrence in the military-industrial complex and incredibly high fiscal costs of nukes, Dr. Fred Kaplan wittingly said that if there were 5 arms of the American military service branches, there would be 5 parts of nuclear deterrence, and instead of the triad, it would be the pentad. Continuing down the fiscal avenue, the monetary costs of nuclear deterrence has been estimated to cost between $5 to $15 trillion. Yes, trillion, between 1945 and 1996 in constant 1996 dollars, which in visual terms represented in dollar bills would reach from the Earth to the moon and nearly back again. Taking a line out of Dwight Eisenhower's farewell address, how many hospitals and schools would that have built? How many social programs could that have supported? How many cancer treatments could have been avoided? How many lives could have been bettered? Nukes are an incredibly expensive weapon that requires major technical skills to even maintain, let alone decommission, with an entire industry not just surrounding nuclear research and development, but also the aforementioned maintenance and decommissioning result of nuclear deterrence policy. They are by design a burgeoning system set to funnel tax dollars right into corporate military-industrial complex crony wallets. Cronyism capitalism fits hand in hand with the concept of nuclear deterrence, as it is by design a way to ensure money flows under a guise of protection through fear-mongering and enabling a certain way of life to flourish, while those who thrive are the minority and those who suffer are the majority. In order for Congress or politicians to even back nuclear non-proliferation treaties or any alterations to the nuclear complex, they force the purchase of missiles, weaponry, or technological advancement as a bribe to back said treaty or policy change. For example, Barack Barack Obama pursued denuclearization through modernization of the current nuclear arsenal, a bit of an oxymoron. Following the common concession that in order for Congress or policymakers to agree to nuclear changes, they need to spend money. Pour more money into the nuclear complex and in turn, the military-industrial complex. So in essence, when one treaty is passed, another form of weaponry is focused on, and then the treaty, as a result, becomes obsolete. For instance, when there was a ban on mid-range missiles, they stopped focusing on mid-range missiles. This would be like banning the Minuteman missiles specifically or giving them up while they are currently decommissioning them and building a new set of $100 billion ICBMs, which is going to replace the archaic and aging system apparently by 2030. But, as many people know, defense budgets have a tendency to spiral out of control and not quite meet deadlines. Distrust, driven by a type of xenophobia leading to a lack of willingness to rethink nuclear deterrent policy, has some proponents claiming that we cannot trust the other nuclearized nations due to them having different values than us. Academic Rebecca Heinrich stated that we are naive to believe that they value human life the same way that we do, which is an incredibly pessimistic approach to seeking a change of attitude towards nuclear weaponry on the global stage. Nuclear deterrence is a set of beliefs. It is an ideology. It cannot be proven or disproven. It is a faith-based construct that is seen as applicable or non-applicable depending on the camp you are from. There's a lot of people conflating causation with correlation when they say that deterrence works on the premise that a nuclear war has not occurred while nukes have existed, which is a logical fallacy. Advocates of nuclear deterrence will counter non-proliferation arguments claiming that we need to modernize and spend even more money on nuclear rearmament and build up in order to counter the Russian and Chinese technology. How American nukes are dilapidated and thusly need to be revamped, and so divert even more public funding towards these programs in order to ensure they have an effective nuclear deterrent policy. Instead of looking at it from a rational perspective of, if the beast is archaic, outdated, and admittedly by these proponents and missions themselves, dying, would it not be best to pursue a new policy, a new path? Would it not be best to try to approach these governments and focus on new policies of nuclear reduction, renewing former treaties, and building upon a new sense of trust? Can we not leave the Cold War in the past and get over the politically charged polarization of nuclear proliferation, where in the event of catastrophe, nobody wins? The Chinese and Russian states are intelligent, far from stupid, far from foolish. They know that nuclear war is unwinnable, and at the end of the day, as has been proven by Russian decisions to de-escalate during the Cold War, do not want all-out total nuclear war, or even all-out conventional war. Aggressive policymaking and posturing is what leads to arms races and spending monies that could be used to advance society in a way that benefits every citizen on an individual level. Arguing that peace can come from aggression is an outdated Reagan-era policy. Strength tactics and fear-mongering are not the path to a cohesive future. We live in cosmopolitan societies that every year become more culturally infused. We are a melting pot of peoples, and with the spread of migrations, it is in our best interest to seek out peaceful opportunities that can bring about prosperity to our nations and an end to a dark and looming cloud that thunders a threat of nuclear annihilation. Imagine if America were to spend their nuclear budgets on societal advances, renewable energies, updating infrastructure, and healthcare. It all starts with trust. We can talk to one another and come to the same conclusion that, morality aside, nuclear weaponry is nonsensical. Breaking away from the profiteering cronies of the military-industrial complex to seek a new path forward. Every nation wants to advance their societies. They want to be able to tackle the changes in the environment. Well, those funds are directly in front of us. It's just a matter of breaking free from the shackles of fear-mongering lobbyists working on behalf of a military-industrial complex only looking to maintain perpetual excessive tax dollars flooding into their coffers. It is redirecting the financial spout towards infrastructure, societal and physical. Self-preservation does not matter if what are we preserving is a society doomed to fail with frail dams and crumbling bridges under a burdensome nuclear budget. Can we truly afford the costs of nuclear deterrence? Is that a gamble worth taking? Are our lives, our children's lives, our grandchildren's lives really that insignificant that we can risk them on a false sense of security predicated upon strength politics? Is it not true that living through fear is in actuality weakness? Being the global schoolyard bully is a projection of insecurities. Why not be the one who stands up for what is right? The right to live a life free of cumbersome thoughts of annihilation, free of nuclear woes. It is time to break free of an erroneous ideology that without nukes, we will be vulnerable, and realize how vulnerable we are because of nukes.